My name is Ryan Stacy, and I am the moderator for Group 1, consisting of myself, Caitlin, Matt, and Anna. We were tasked to answer the following questions. What are presidential decrees? Are they good for economic policy making? And are they good for democracy? This is an important topic to analyze because it provides the opportunity to better understand the power of the executive branch in the various countries of Latin America. Our first presenter is Anna, who focuses her attention on question 1 of the assignment.
Hello, my name is Anna Samanamu, and I will be answering the question of what are presidential decrees. Presidential decrees are considered to be judgments of a court that announces the legal consequences of the facts found in a particular case and orders that the court's decisions to be carried out. Surrounding this definition, authors Jose Antonio Chaibub, Zachary Elkins, and Tom Ginsberg, in their essay Latin American Presidentialism in Comparative and Historical Perspectives, offers a comparison between presidential and parliamentary by basically illustrating that heads of governments within the parliamentary systems are thought to be vested with powers that their counterparts within the presidential systems do not necessarily have, like decree power or legislative initiative. At the same time, in Latin American countries, its constitutions were established in 3 parts: to be uniquely inclined to empower presidents with decree laws, secondly, to initiate legislative proposals, and lastly, to exert powers in emergency conditions. On the other hand, Chaibub, Elkins, and Ginsberg really detail that the drafters of presidential constitutions, especially in the 19th century Latin American countries, did not choose between the presidential and the parliamentary models that are available today, but instead they would choose between a monarchy and a republic. However, when it comes to executive powers, presidents are really able to do the following: to issue executive decrees, to assume emergency powers, to propose constitutional amendments, to propose budget laws, etc. Now I'm going to detail 2 cases of Latin American countries that often have dealt with presidential decrees, in the case of Brazil and Venezuela. So firstly, with the example of Brazil, authors Carlos Pereira, Timothy J. Power, and Lucio Reno, in their essay Under What Conditions Do Presidents Resort to Decree Power? Theory and Evidence from the Brazilian Case, they established that presidential popularity is only weakly related to the use of decree authority, also to executive legislative relationships, especially coalition management via multi-party cabinets. It's usually seen as more of a reliable predictor. The authors also emphasize that Brazil has governmental support within the Chamber of Deputies. It often has more fluctuation in presidential popularity, having higher party fragmentation within the legislative and electoral arenas, and having greater reliance in unilateral executive initiative when it comes to policy making. Also, there was one instance in the case for the executive power that, not surprisingly, is often interpreted to be self-servingly the constitutional requisite of urgency. Secondly, as Pereira power in Reno State. Usually, the executive position was to observe very few limits as to what types of policies could be initiated or altered via a decree. This actually further led Congress to really have a lot of discussions and disagreements regarding the extent of decree authority and how to really minimize it to a point. However, that wasn't really resolved until 2001 during the Cardozo administration. Moving on, lastly, to the example of the country of Venezuela, it also serves as an example, more specifically in the year 2015, when President Nicolás Maduro was, according to BBC News, granted the power to govern by decree until December 31st. The reason why this basically occurred was due to the fact that Maduro explained to the National Assembly that he really needed some type of reinforcement to really deal with the threat that they felt was being posed by the United States, to which he, at a point, said that they were sticking their nose in Venezuela's business. However, this really led the opposition to express that Maduro was using the incident to amass power and to really take away attention from the economic crisis that Venezuela was going through at that point. However, Diosdado Cabello, who was president of the National Assembly, he claimed that Maduro's actions were to actually be considered as an act of aggression against all the free countries in the world that were really accepting American imperialism. Needless to say, Maduro actually believed that while implementing his presidential decree, it was actually giving him the power to really defend peace and sovereignty, which evidently reiterating the whole point, was really granting him the power to actually issue these decrees in the first place, but he solely focused on the matters of public security and defense. Thank you.
Our next presenter is Matt, who focused his attention on the question of whether or not presidential decrees are good for economic policymaking.
Now, since we know what presidential decrees are, let's take a look at whether or not they translate into true economic growth that actually benefits the citizens they're intended to serve. Now, in order to answer this question, does presidential decrees actually have a positive economic impact? We're going to take a look at the case of Venezuela, specifically the Chavez and Maduro administrations. Now, Hugo Chavez was notorious for utilizing presidential decrees to further his Bolivarian revolution. Now, what exactly was the Bolivarian Revolution? Well, it was a plan initiated by Hugo Chavez, often through presidential decrees, and basically it was a response to the neoliberal policies and reforms that were sweeping Latin America. Chavez didn't particularly care for the neoliberal reforms, and he believed that Latin America deserved its own system of politics and economics free from Western influence. Now, oftentimes, this Bolivarian revolution that was enacted by Chavez encompassed broad nationalization, the expansion of social welfare programs, as well as the repeal of any type of neoliberal reform initiated within Venezuela, as well as encouraging other nations to repeal similar neoliberal reforms initiated in the past several decades. He also marginalized private property and the role of private enterprise in the economy and attempted to have more state control over the various industries. Now, of course, he achieved a lot of these aims through presidential decrees, and they had a mostly negative effect. In fact, under Chavez's Bolivarian Revolution, many Venezuelans fled the nation, and there was also an increased level of capital flights. That meant more money was leaving Venezuela than was coming in. Now, following Chavez's death, his successor Maduro also continued the trend of utilizing presidential decrees as well as Chavez's carrying forth Chavez's economic policies. And in January of this year, he was actually forced to declare a presidential decree which noted that Venezuela was in an economic state of emergency. Maduro issued a 60-day decree, and in issuing this decree, he notes that this emergency decree is a plan that has the guiding elements of what should be a plan for everyone. And he asked that the National Assembly, even though they did not have to, would back the decree. And basically what he ordered was access to all budgets of the national government, as well as money that was previously set aside and that was restricted and that he could not access, he now has access to as well. Also in the decree were provisions for him to assume control of private enterprises, to boost production, and to increase efficiency of the labor force. Now, this was in January, and in April of this year, he was forced to issue an additional decree because the economic situation in Venezuela has not improved and it has continued to deteriorate. And this one's kind of a little bit unique because it shows the desperation that the national government in Venezuela is reaching. And this one's unique because in Venezuela right now, there's a resource shortage, and one of the resources that's in shortage is electricity. And so in April, several weeks before this recording, Maduro issued an additional decree in which he told government workers not to come into work on Fridays for the next 2 months, because the national government and the national power grid simply does not have enough electricity to power these buildings. And the thinking and logic behind that is, well, if we don't have all these government workers coming in at least once a week, we can conserve electricity and hopefully keep the lights on for everyone in the nation. Now, in these three instances, Chavez's presidential decrees during his so-called Bolivarian Revolution, and then Maduro's presidential decrees in January and April of this year, both demonstrate that there really isn't a positive impact of governing through decrees, at least on the economic side. And a lot of times as well, these decrees are also marginalizing the national legislature, but also marginalizing the citizens who put them into office, and starting to lead through strife and protest as citizens are realizing that conditions are not getting any better. And not only are conditions worsening, but they also are having less and less power over their government because the president is able just to rule through decrees.
Our next presenter is Caitlin, who briefly discusses all three questions.
The page numbers that I mentioned are from the citations that I use, and I'm going to address all of the questions in their entirety as follows. Many Latin American countries' national constitutions provide a good deal of maneuverability for presidents to issue forth decrees. A presidential decree is a rule of law issued forth by a president of a nation-state. In a legalistic sense, as a law, it possesses what the great legal scholar Thomas Aquinas would term as being the character of force, which means that it is enforceable by means of the apparatus of the state, meaning the police, military, judicial courts, and so on. Page 9. While this may appear to be self-evident, this is actually an important distinction, because a law that is issued forth by a presidential decree enjoys the same institutional safeguards as those formed by legislative consensus. Laws formulated and passed by states' legislators are composed by the state and are of the state's jurisdiction, whereas laws passed by presidential decree are composed outside the purview of the state as a whole, but the state is still nonetheless made responsible for their enforceability. In terms of democracy, this is a troubling predicament. How can laws decreed by one individual, regardless of the fact whether or not that person possesses presidential power, be integrated into a system that is, at least ostensibly, governed chiefly by the will of the people? Well, to begin, presidential decrees in Latin America are complex. Daniel Hellinger cites that prior to President Carlos Menem taking office in Argentina, for a span of a total of 140 years, only 35 presidential decrees had been issued. However, upon assuming office in 1989 up until 1997, Carlos Menem had passed a total of 166 decrees of necessity and urgency in his first 8 years as president. Hellinger, page 430. These decrees were hardly either necessary or urgent, and Menem's powers could have been curtailed, but he made many Supreme Court appointments to ensure he would not meet significant resistance by filling the court with those who were personally loyal to him. However, Hellinger is correct to remark that such examples are indicative of what he terms as being part of a hyper-presidentialism in Latin America. This hyper-presidentialism isn't healthy for democracies because it erodes the inherent separation of powers that safeguards democracy. As mentioned, the power to make decrees can often go unchallenged if a president is popular and can offer patronage. Although presidential decrees are harmful for democracy, it could stand to reason that they might be beneficial to Latin America's economy. The ability to bypass legislative gridlock for economic policy making is an attractive proposition. However, as the authors of the study Latin American Presidentialism in Comparative and Historical Perspective find, majoritarian elections and initiatives, empirically speaking, facilitate smaller governments, smaller welfare states, and smaller deficits, page 178. Though it would appear that legislative decrees would bypass partisan quibbling, allowing for real and meaningful change to take place, this is not the case. The example of Hugo Chavez's rise in Venezuela is a telling case, page 110. He had begun to nationalize industries upon assuming office with little legislative resistance and greatly degraded the quality of Venezuela's democracy and economy in the process. From the aforementioned case studies, it stands to follow logically that unchecked presidentialism does far more harm than good for both the health of democracies and economic policies in Latin America. While this may appear to be counterintuitive in a sense, that strong executive orders would have far more potential, as the political phrase goes, of getting things done, the initiatives accomplished oftentimes do not represent the will of the people, and consequently the interests of the people and nations as a unified whole. Presidents and members of government would do well to issue and review all legislation, as it is most effectively corresponds to democratic consensus.
All right, so before wrapping up the presentation, I would like to add a few words on the topic of presidential decrees and their effect on democracy. In my opinion, there are situations in which presidential decrees can be good for democracy, such as a president's decree of a state of emergency. This was seen in Chile in 2010 when President Michelle Bachelet issued a state of emergency following an earthquake. She enforced rules such as a strict curfew and ordered military patrol throughout the country. This is a good example of a presidential decree's potential positive influence on democracy because it shows the executive branch using this exclusive power only when necessary. However, there are certain instances in Latin American history where the ordering of a presidential decree was abused. An example of this can be found in the region of Brazil. As originally found in the Brazilian Constitution of 1988, Brazilian presidents held the authority to issue provisional decrees when facing a situation of urgency and relevance. The power was provisional because a decree would expire after 30 days if Congress did not pass it as law. Things sort of went awry as presidents began to reinterpret what constitutes an urgent and relevant situation. Also, the 30-day expiration set in place by Congress was usually easy to bypass for a president by simply reissuing the decree. By 2001, Brazilian executives had issued 619 original decrees and reissued decrees another 1,600 times. Another example of a presidential decree negatively influencing democracy can be found in Venezuela. In 2000, Venezuela's National Assembly passed a bill known as the Enabling Act, which granted former President Hugo Chavez the right to rule by decree for the entire following year. In November 2001, shortly before the act was set to expire, Chavez used it to put into place a set of 49 laws central to the implementation of his programs. These laws, however, ultimately didn't favor Venezuelan constituents. Instead, the law hurt the job market, caused strikes, and led to an eventual coup demanding the removal of these 49 laws. To conclude, presidential decrees could have a negative influence on democracy if abused. They can illuminate situations in which a president clearly has too much power. Certain Latin American cases, such as the Venezuelan case, also show that presidential decrees can cause an extreme divide between a government and its citizens. Thank you, and this concludes our presentation.